These weren't just movies, they were cinematic bombs dropped on audiences who thought they'd seen it all. The 1960s gave us plenty of classics, but in the shadows lurked films that were too raw, too wild, and too shocking for polite society. Censors raided theaters, critics screamed outrage, and fans lined up anyway. So what happens when filmmakers push the screen to its absolute limits? Let's dive into the 12 exploitation films from the 60s that rocked the world. Blood Feast, 1963. Imagine walking into a small Miami theater in 1963, expecting a cheap horror flick, only to watch a caterer carve up women for an Egyptian goddess ritual. That was Blood Feast, the film that practically invented the gore movie. Directed by Herschel Gordon Lewis, a man now called the godfather of gore. It was cheap, badly acted, and packed with stage blood that looked like red paint. But it changed cinema forever. Audiences weren't ready. Cops raided screenings, nurses were planted in theaters to calm down fainting viewers, and critics called it garbage for the sick. The UK banned it, Canada seized prints, and even in the US, local police threatened theater owners with arrests. Lewis didn't fight the controversy, he used it. Ads screamed, "Too shocking for human eyes," and moviegoers ate it up. The final tally? Over $4 million in grindhouse box office returns, all from a film shot for under $25,000. The success launched Lewis's entire career and spawned what we now call splatter cinema. Without Blood Feast, there's no Friday the 13th, no Evil Dead, no endless waves of gore-laden horror. And here's the kicker. Lewis loved every bad review. To him, being called the worst director alive was free advertising. The film's legacy lives on, not because it's great, because it's outrageous. It turned cheap gore into a moneymaker and proved audiences secretly wanted to see just how far the screen could go. Blood Feast wasn't polished, it wasn't classy, but it was the spark that lit the fire. Exploitation cinema was officially on the map, and Hollywood could never look away again. Common Law Cabin, 1967. Russ Meyer was never shy about stirring the pot. And Common Law Cabin proved he could take even a simple desert setting and turn it into a powder keg of scandal. Shot in the blazing Arizona heat, with a budget barely big enough to rent a cabin, the film told the story of a riverboat tour guide, his dysfunctional family, and the chaotic strangers who crash into their lives. What followed was less about plot and more about tension, jealousy, and excess. Characters bicker, betray, and manipulate each other until violence inevitably explodes. Meyer's trademark style, sharp editing, bold close-ups, and dialogue that crackles with dark humor kept audiences glued to the screen even when the story itself seemed half-improvised. The cabin, isolated on the river, became a pressure cooker where every character's darkest impulses surfaced. When it landed in theaters, censors bristled. Chicago and Dallas banned it, calling it immoral and obscene. Police in Phoenix raided a screening, confiscated prints, and threatened the theater owner with fines. But as always, the controversy only drove more people to see it. In grindhouses across America, the tagline alone, "Adults Only," was enough to guarantee packed seats. What made Common Law Cabin infamous was how raw it felt. Unlike Hollywood melodramas that hinted at domestic strife, Meyer stripped away the polish and showed a world where family loyalty collapsed under greed and desire. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't moral, it was exploitation in its purest form. And financially, it worked. The movie cost almost nothing to make but returned several times its budget, keeping Meyer on track to dominate late 60s exploitation and pave the way for his even bigger hits. Common Law Cabin shocked not with special effects or gore, but by exposing the ugliness simmering inside ordinary people. In Meyer's world, the desert sun didn't just burn skin, it burned away every pretense of decency. Scum of the Earth, 1963. If Blood Feast gave birth to gore, Scum of the Earth was the ugly older cousin of sleaze. Herschel Gordon Lewis, never one to shy away from shock, made this on the quick and cheap, and it's often credited as the very first roughie. Forget playful pin-up stories. This one dropped audiences into the filthy world of underground photo shoots where naive young girls were lured into modeling and then blackmailed into far worse. Shot in stark black and white, the movie looked more like a crime documentary than a piece of drive-in fun. The plot followed an innocent college girl who gets trapped in the hands of photographers, exploiting her for every dime. The men are disgusting, the women are desperate, and the whole film drips with grime. Lewis knew exactly what he was doing. He wanted viewers to feel dirty walking out. When it landed in theaters, watchdog groups lost their minds. Critics screamed that it was the end of cinema as we knew it. Censorship boards in places like Memphis, Boston, and Los Angeles refused to grant it licenses. But in grindhouse districts, especially along New York's 42nd Street, it ran for months. Word spread. This wasn't glamorous, it was cruel. And that cruelty was the selling point. What makes Scum of the Earth legendary isn't its craft, it's its nerve. It proved there was an audience for films that went beyond teasing and dove into pure exploitation. Lewis himself later admitted they made it because filth paid the rent. In the hierarchy of exploitation, Scum of the Earth stands tall as the film that opened the floodgates. From here on, exploitation wouldn't just hint at taboo, it would shove audiences face first into it. Olga's House of Shame, 1964. If you thought exploitation was already scraping the bottom of the barrel, the Olga films happily dug deeper. Olga's House of Shame, the third entry in the notorious trilogy, was where everything came. Together, white slavery, drugs, and punishment all rolled into one gritty little package. Audrey Campbell starred as Olga, a cold, merciless queenpin who ruled her criminal empire with iron fists and whips. Shot guerrilla style around New York with practically no budget, the production leaned on real strippers and burlesque dancers as cast members. Locations were borrowed, scenes were dubbed later, and everything had a raw, handmade feel. But what it lacked in polish, it more than made up for in audacity. This wasn't glamorous crime, it was a world of intimidation, violence, and submission. Censors immediately pounced. Cities like Chicago, Boston, and Los Angeles banned it. The UK refused to classify it at all. Churches led protests. Feminist groups demanded screenings be shut down. And, of course, that kind of attention only guaranteed box office success. In Times Square, it ran for 40 straight weeks, pulling in an astonishing $2 million on a budget under $20,000. Audrey Campbell's performance sealed her place as an underground legend. She didn't play Olga with camp or winks to the camera. She was icy, terrifying, and believable. That realism made the movie's cruelty sting even harder. Olga's House of Shame was a turning point. It wasn't about blood or cheap thrills. It was about psychological domination, power, and the shock of watching it unfold on screen. Exploitation had found a new weapon. Fear wrapped in authority. Shanty Tramp, 1967. If you want a picture of small-town America at its ugliest, Shanty Tramp delivers it in spades. Shot in Florida with a tiny budget, this sweaty, grimy exploitation drama shocked audiences with its mix of racial tension, hypocrisy, and Southern sleaze. The story follows a young woman known only as the Shanty Tramp, who uses her looks to manipulate the men in her town, setting off a chain of violence that drags everyone down with her. The film doesn't pull punches. It dives headfirst into alcoholism, corruption, and racial prejudice, painting a picture of the South that many in the 1960s didn't want on screen. For audiences expecting glossy Hollywood melodramas, this was like watching a bomb go off in a church social. Censors immediately pounced. In states like Georgia and Alabama, theater boards banned it outright, claiming it stirred racial unrest. Even in bigger cities, screenings were stormed by protesters. But in grindhouse districts like New York's 42nd Street, the film played to packed houses. Viewers weren't seeing Hollywood's polished South. They were seeing something raw, mean, and uncomfortably real. Critics shredded it. They called it tasteless, offensive, and amateurish. But that was exactly why it worked. Shot with non-professional actors, using real backwoods towns and dirt roads, Shanty Tramp looked and felt like reality. The ugliness of its world wasn't hidden. It was paraded in front of the audience. And financially, it punched above its weight. Despite bans and boycotts, it made back its budget many times over. Its notoriety guaranteed it a place in exploitation history, And today it stands as a perfect example of how low-budget cinema could stir more outrage than million-dollar studio projects. Shanty Tramp shocked because it held up a mirror to a society full of prejudice and corruption. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't polished, but that's why it lingers, because sometimes the dirtiest stories stick the hardest. Something Weird, 1967. If Herschel Gordon Lewis had one gift, it was finding brand new ways to make audiences squirm. Something Weird might be his strangest creation, part supernatural thriller, part psychedelic fever dream, and part complete nonsense. The plot: a man gains psychic powers after an accident, strikes a deal with a witch to fix his scarred face, and ends up in a hallucinatory nightmare filled with violence, strange visions, and bizarre encounters. Shot on a shoestring, the movie feels like a mashup of horror and counterculture paranoia. Audiences in the 1960s were already hearing about LSD, hippie communes, and strange new cults. Lewis threw all of that into the blender and poured out something messy, confusing, and, most importantly, shocking. The editing was jagged, the performances erratic, but the images stuck in your brain. Censors hated it. In several states, authorities slapped bans on screenings, calling it a danger to young minds. Critics shredded it as incoherent trash, but grindhouse theaters couldn't care less. For audiences already fascinated by the idea of altered states and hidden powers, Something Weird delivered the perfect midnight trip. What makes it important is how it showed the flexibility of exploitation cinema. It wasn't just about gore or cruelty. It could also tap into cultural fear. Here, the fear wasn't a monster under the bed. It was a world spinning out of control, filled with drugs, witches, and psychic powers nobody could explain. Something Weird might not make much sense, but that's exactly why it lingers. It's less a movie and more a ride, and in exploitation, sometimes that's enough to burn it into history. The Wild Angels, 1966. Before Easy Rider defined counterculture cool, Roger Corman's The Wild Angels roared into theaters and gave audiences a raw, unfiltered look at America's outlaw biker subculture. With Peter Fonda at the helm, backed by Nancy Sinatra and Bruce Dern, this gritty film ignited the biker movie craze of the late 1960s. The story follows Heavenly Blues by Fonda, the leader of a motorcycle gang who sets out to retrieve a stolen bike belonging to a fellow rider. What begins as a simple mission spirals into a series of violent confrontations, reckless parties, and a funeral that erupts into pure chaos. Corman used the loose narrative not just to deliver action, but to showcase a world of restless youth rejecting authority and embracing life on the edge. What made The Wild Angels stand out was its authenticity. Filmed with real members of the Hells Angels as extras, it blurred the line between fiction and documentary-style realism. Audiences had rarely seen anything like it: roaring motorcycles, leather jackets, and a lifestyle both dangerous and strangely magnetic. The tagline summed it up best. Their credo is violence. Their god is hate. And they call themselves the Wild Angels. At the box office, it was a massive success for an exploitation picture, grossing more than $15 million on a budget of less than $400,000. Critics were divided, with some condemning its glorification of lawlessness, while others praised its stark, unapologetic style. But for drive-in crowds, it was unforgettable. Over the years, the film has been recognized as a cultural milestone. It not only inspired countless biker movies, but also set the stage for the counterculture cinema explosion that defined the end of the decade. The Wild Angels was more than just another biker flick. It was a loud, fearless statement that proved exploitation films could tap directly into the cultural pulse of their time. Vixen, 1968. Russ Meyer was already known for pushing buttons, but Vixen turned him into a legend. This was the first American X-rated exploitation film to make a mainstream splash, and it made an absolute fortune. The story followed Vixen, a woman living in the Canadian wilderness, who seduces just about everyone she meets, including characters most audiences in 1968 never expected to see together on screen. What shocked people wasn't just the content, it was the boldness. Interracial encounters, family taboos, and raw dialogue that poked fun at race and politics all collided in one outrageous package. Meyer shot it with slick cinematography and tongue-in-cheek humor, but underneath the jokes was something America wasn't ready to face. Censors lost their minds. Cities like Dallas, Miami, and Boston banned it. A theater owner in Florida was arrested just for showing it. In 1969, the U.S. Senate even launched an obscenity investigation and cited Vixen by name. But none of that stopped Meyer. If anything, it fueled the movie's success. The numbers were staggering. Made for less than $100,000, Vixen grossed over $8 million. It ran for almost a year straight in Los Angeles, proving that controversy could be the best advertising of all. Vixen didn't just shock, it rewrote the rules. Meyer proved that underground films could rake in mainstream money, and in the process, he built a career off daring audiences to look at what they said they didn't want to see. The Touch of Her Flesh, 1967. If there was ever a film that captured the phrase, "filth pays the rent," it was The Touch of Her Flesh. Directed by Michael Findlay under the alias Julian Marsh, this low-budget shocker told the story of a man who, after a brutal accident, loses his sight and spirals into a deranged hatred of women. What followed was a string of murders, executed with knives, darts, and even poisoned roses. The film starred Roberta Findlay, Michael's real-life wife, who became known as the Queen of Underground Sleaze. Together, they crafted a grimy little thriller that wasn't rated, wasn't polished, and wasn't welcome in respectable theaters. Cities like Boston and Detroit banned it. Canadian Customs seized prints at the border, calling it dangerously corrupting. And in New Jersey, a theater owner was arrested for screening it, but kept showing it anyway out of spite. Audiences were divided. Some walked out in disgust. Others couldn't get enough. The controversy made it profitable enough to spawn 2 sequels, The Curse of Her Flesh and The Kiss of Her Flesh, completing what fans now call the Flesh Trilogy. The Findlays didn't try to dress it up. They knew what they were making. Roberta later said bluntly, "We made filth because filth paid the rent." And she wasn't wrong. The trilogy carved out a devoted audience and cemented their names in grindhouse history. The Touch of Her Flesh wasn't art. It was exploitation at its rawest. And that's exactly why it worked. Motorcycle, 1965. By the mid-60s, America was obsessed with motorcycles, and exploitation cinema knew exactly how to twist that fascination. Enter Motorcycle, Russ Meyer's violent little desert nightmare. Released in 1965, it told the story of a trio of sadistic bikers who terrorize a rural community, leaving destruction and trauma in their wake. If you've heard of Meyer for his wild camp comedies or infamous later hits, this one was darker, nastier, and way more unsettling. The setup was simple, but effective. A veterinarian discovers his wife brutalized by the gang and sets out to hunt them down, eventually teaming up with a vengeful widow whose husband has already been killed by the same outlaws. Together, they bring the fight back to the bikers in a story that feels equal parts Western, revenge thriller, and exploitation shocker. What made it notorious wasn't just the violence, it was the atmosphere. Shot in stark desert landscapes, the film oozed menace. The bikers weren't cartoonish rebels, they were predators, dangerous and unpredictable. For 1965, audiences used to Hollywood's carefully polished motorcycle stories. This was like being sucker punched with grit. Censors, unsurprisingly, tried to shut it down. Several southern states banned screenings altogether, while others demanded cuts. But the grindhouse circuit ate it up. Drive-ins especially loved it, pairing it with other outlaw films to sell double bills that practically promised audiences a night of chaos. The impact was bigger than expected. Motorcycle paved the way for Faster, Pussycat, Kill, which came out the same year, and together the 2 films cemented Meyer's reputation as the master of shock cinema. And financially, it was a win, cheaply made, quickly shot, and profitable enough to keep Meyer independent from Hollywood forever. Motorcycle proved you didn't need big budgets to terrify an audience. You just needed a roaring bike, a stretch of desert, and the guts to push boundaries that mainstream films wouldn't touch. Blast of Silence, 1961. Before the decade went into full grindhouse overdrive, there was Blast of Silence, a movie that looked more like a film noir but hit audiences with exploitation's raw power. Directed by Alan Barron and shot guerrilla style on the streets of New York, it told the story of Frankie Bono, a lonely hitman returning to the city during Christmas to carry out a job. What he found instead was alienation, paranoia, and the crushing emptiness of his own life. Unlike Hollywood crime pictures, there was nothing glamorous about Frankie. He wasn't slick or charming, he was broken. The narration, delivered in a gravelly second-person growl, forced audiences to live inside his crumbling mind. You're alone, you always will be. It was chilling, intimate, and completely different from anything else in 1961. The style was pure grit. Barron used real streets, bars, and alleys, often, without permits. Passers-by in the background had no idea they were part of a film. The result was a New York that felt alive, dirty, and dangerous. You could practically smell the snow and exhaust in every frame. When it premiered, critics didn't know what to make of it. Too bleak for mainstream audiences, too raw for the studio system. It slipped into grindhouses where it found a second life. People came for a crime thriller, but left shaken by how close it felt to real loneliness and violence. Over time, its reputation grew. Restored by Criterion decades later, Blast of Silence is now hailed as a lost classic. But in its own time, it was an outsider, grimy, daring, and brutally unsentimental. Blast of Silence didn't shock with gore or chaos. It shocked with honesty. It stripped away the glamour of crime and left nothing but cold streets and colder hearts. Mondo Cane. Though technically Italian in origin, Mondo Cane became an American grindhouse phenomenon and sparked an entire wave of exploitation documentaries known as Mondo films. Its title translates to A Dog's World, and that's exactly how it presented humanity. Cruel, chaotic, and bizarre. The film stitched together had never seen. Marketed in America as a shocking documentary, it blurred the line between anthropology and pure spectacle. When it hit U.S. theaters in 1962, audiences were stunned. Some called it an educational look at global culture. Others called it sadistic exploitation, masquerading as fact. Critics were divided, censors panicked, and theater owners quickly realized they had a goldmine. People who wouldn't normally step foot into a grindhouse came out just to see what everyone was whispering about. The impact was massive. Mondo Cane was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Original Song, even as governments around the world banned it. In America, it ran for months in major cities, earning millions and spawning endless imitations like Women of the World and Africa Addio. Mondo Cane shocked not with monsters or crime, but with the uncomfortable truth that the strangest, most disturbing spectacle of all was real human life. So there you have it. 12 films that didn't just push boundaries, they bulldozed them. They horrified critics, enraged censors, and in many cases, made fortunes doing it. Love them or hate them, these movies remind us that cinema's darker corners have always been a magnet for curiosity. Which of these do you think still holds the power to shock today? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit subscribe for more wild cinema history, and remember, sometimes the film society wants to bury are the ones we can't forget.